This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome to Indian Country Today, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. These are the news headlines for Monday, July 13th. Dan Snyder once said he would never, all caps, change the name of the Washington NFL team. Never is today. Earlier this month, Snyder said there would be a thorough review of the team's name in light of the death of George Floyd and renewed debate on race in America. This is a huge victory for advocates such as Suzanne Harjo, Amanda Blackhorse, and Susan White, who have been working on this issue literally for decades. The NFL team was in a tough spot. Retailers Amazon, Target, Walmart, Nike, and Dick's Sporting Goods all refused to sell gear from the NFL team. In Oklahoma City this weekend, there was a sit-in at a monument commemorating the 1889 land rush. Ginny Underwood has this report.
Race hatred cannot stop us.
Today we're talking about history in Oklahoma.
We're not going to talk to them. We're not going to say anything to them. We're not going to antagonize them in any way.
It is the largest monument in the United States, maybe the world. It's made completely out of bronze. It was made by a Muskogee Creek citizen named Paul Moore. It cost $6.2 million, but it sits on public property.
We feel that all this is the people's of Oklahoma, and we just don't want a few 1% to decide what to do with it.
What's your role here today?
Oh, to just protect, just put my body in between to just make sure that everybody's safe.
We are not here to do any kind of damage to any of the grounds or any of the monuments. We're here to educate.
I've been trying to watch and listen. Y'all are in my way.
There were 7 land runs and land grabs that happened across Indian Territory from 1889 to 1895. Know what you celebrate. You're celebrating homelessness, theft, murder.
We have the right to stand up for ourselves. Yes.
My people had to get a permit to stand and protest on land that is theirs. Understand it. That is an atrocity.
Get out of my way. That's the problem. It's not white people.
Today and every day forward, we must commit to accept no more structures and stories that tell half-truths, like that mass of a monument down the way that tells half a truth. We can't have that. No more.
The Trump administration continues its push to reopen schools this fall, despite the rising numbers of COVID-19 infections. The president has said the current CDC guidelines are too expensive. Health experts say that's impossible to protect children when the infection has not been controlled in a community. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said it will issue new guidelines later this week. The previous guidelines called for schools to have social distancing and wearing masks to operate safely. Indian Country Today has been tracking COVID-19 cases and deaths in Indian Country for the past 3 months. We now turn to ICT's Washington editor, Jordan Bennett-Begay, for the latest update. Good morning, Jordan.
Mark. So we have the COVID-19 updates from 3 tribes across the country, and here's the latest numbers that we have. Over the weekend, the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona got a total of 50 new cases over the weekend, and now that brings them to a total of 2,052 cases and 27 deaths. And for the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community in Arizona, they also had more cases over the weekend because that's a huge hotspot right now, Mark. So now their total is 265 cases right now, and a lot of these cases come from members who live within community members who live within the community boundary on the reservation, some who are non-members, and so the data is all over the place and breaking down. And Salt River is very close to the metro area too in Phoenix. And then for the Navajo Nation that spans across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, they saw an additional 145 new cases and 15 more deaths over the weekend. So this gives the tribe a total of 8,187 cases and 401 deaths. And overall, total within the Indian health system, there are 13,291 cases and 555 deaths in the Indian health system as of today.
Thank you, Jordan Bennett-Begay.
Mark.
We'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Carla Fredericks, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation has been at the center of two major stories in Indian country, the economics of the mascot debate and Standing Rock. She is director of the American Indian Law Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School, as well as executive director of First Peoples Worldwide. This is an amazing day to have a conversation, Carla Fredericks. Welcome to Indian Country Today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking about the Washington NFL team. First, what went through your mind when never happened?
Well, I guess the phrase is never say never, all in caps. You know, as Indian people, we play the long game and we persevered and got through it. And there's still a lot of work to be done, but today is definitely a momentous occasion.
There was a pretty sophisticated strategy to not just look at the public work of the Washington NFL team, but behind the scenes, and particularly focusing on investors. Maybe talk about how that all started.
Sure. So the investor work has received a lot of attention in the past couple of weeks, but it's actually work that's been going on for a couple of decades as well. One of the things that happened was that in the early 1990s, Gary Brous, who is a member of the Ponca Nation, and Susan White, who was the trust director for the Oneida Tribe of Wisconsin, got together and started talking about racist mascots in sports and how their work related to investor engagement could be deployed to try to address this ongoing issue. So over the past couple of decades, there have been various engagements with companies that have business relationships, particularly to the Washington team, that up until recently hadn't really had a lot of traction. And what happened in the past couple of weeks has really been sort of the story of this amazing moment, which is a lot of very rapid movement on lingering serious issues of race in this country. And we were able to just ensure that the Washington team name became part of that discussion.
Some of the companies involved, let's maybe take apart Federal Express. In the beginning, they weren't that receptive.
No, they were not only not receptive, but they used every tool at their disposal to try to prevent any engagement on the issue by anyone, not just Native Americans, but also institutional investors who, for their own reasons, both moral reasons and business reasons, were very concerned about the attachment of the company to the team. So it was really a fight on all fronts, I would say, even on the economic side. And eventually we were able to secure a meeting between Susan White and the CEO of FedEx, Fred Smith. But it took years to even get to that point, and it took years to get an audience with the annual meeting of shareholders.
I remember reading one of the letters from the general counsel of FedEx, who basically said, this is not an investment issue, and just was dismissive of the idea.
Right. And I think what's really happened in the last couple of weeks is that people are really beginning to understand how corporate behavior should be looked at holistically, that what people might consider investment issues it should be broader to encapsulate investment risk on social issues, as well as investment risk on environmental and governance issues.
And indeed, with all of these companies, there's a cost to the decisions they make when they push back against an NFL franchise, for example, or not reacting to the name change. There's a social cost to that.
Right. And I think that, companies are in kind of a tough spot because they have to weigh the economic impact of their behavior in several different ways. It's sort of like 7-dimensional chess. And I think that it weights differently depending on whatever the circumstances are. So FedEx has the naming rights to the field where the Washington team plays. There's a contract that's a several $100 million contract that attaches to that. When you weigh that against the concerns of Native American groups and social investors, perhaps prior to the tragic death of George Floyd and this moment that we're in, that might have been weighted in a particular way. And now that FedEx has been really subject to social pressure because of the moment we're in, I think now it's weighing differently.
I think one piece of this that people might not understand is that the pressure doesn't end here. Maybe talk about what's next in that regard.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole movement for this in the investor community, and I think in the Native American community as well, is not just about the Washington team, but about the use of our likeness as Indian people in professional and scholastic sports, and how that likeness is not really honorific, as some people may think, but really that it has a damaging effect, particularly on our youth and in how we think about ourselves. And there have been incredible studies that have been done on this. Stephanie Freiberg, who's Tulalip, of course, is the leading expert in this in the scholarly community. And I think for the social investors, this is a broader issue. This has always been a broader issue. And although this is a significant win in terms of moving the needle on this issue, for the social investors, this conversation is far from over.
And it also allows you to keep pressure on the team should they not go far enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that this is happening in the context of football, because there are so many great football analogies that can be drawn here. And if you're a fan of the game, as I am, it does feel like fourth quarter, you know, with just seconds left, and anything could really happen still at this point. I think we have to take the team at their word. That they are rebranding, that they are walking away from the name and from the logo, but they haven't said what the new name and logo are going to be. And I think the concern is that it could still be highly problematic.
Well, and that kind of raises the question of how you go forward in terms of your fan base. We both have experience with North Dakota. And in North Dakota, no matter changing the name, it didn't matter to many of the fans. And of course, the UND actually helped that along, which is something Washington very well could do as well.
Right. And I think this is a moment for leadership. You know, I think that we could look backwards and feel angry or upset about, you know, how long this took or what the road was to get here. But I'm an optimistic person. I think as Indian people, our very survival is based on the fact that we're pretty optimistic and pretty generous. And so if we look at this moment as a change moment and as a moment of possibility, I think that there is real possibility for leadership here by the Washington Football Club.
Speaking of the opportunity for leadership, let's change topics here. Another never say never until it happens would be what happens on the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And a couple of months ago, the idea that oil would stop flowing would have been inconceivable. But again, this is something that goes back a long time, and it involves the investor community in a way that's not in the headlines. Maybe talk about your role in that and how it got started.
Sure. So it's sort of similar to what happened here with the Washington team, in that there was advocacy by the tribe that investors were really brought into as allies. And the reason for that is because a project of the size of the Dakota Access Pipeline requires a lot of investment capital behind it. The project was originally supposed to cost $3.2 billion or so, and it was financed by a consortium of 17 investment banks. And what's interesting about investment banks is that investment banks are represented in the capital markets by publicly traded securities. And so anyone who has a portfolio that's invested in index funds, say, probably owns significant amounts of investment bank stocks. And so looking at all of the circumstances surrounding the pipeline, environmental circumstances, as well as the circumstances for the tribes that were affected, where their free, prior, and informed consent was simply not solicited and definitely not given. The investors were very concerned about the risk associated with the project. And as things started to play out, where the tribes and the Native American community and others really stood up to the pipeline and tried to prevent it from being built, the investors were super concerned about the possibility of actually losing a whole bunch of money because of what was going on. And so we had a very strong coalition in that fight of many investors, including investors who you wouldn't really characterize as social investors, pension funds and the like, who just saw the Dakota Access Pipeline for what it was, which is a very bad investment.
Well, and I think that's really a key thing here, is that no matter what happens from now on, that idea of how much risk is involved with some of these mega projects is going to have to be in the accounting, where people are going to have to say, have you thought about this? This could be really expensive.
Right. And I mean, companies take reserves all the time in their accounting for different types of risk, environmental risk, litigation risk, and so on. They're really behind in terms of assessing and accounting for social risk. And investors have a fiduciary responsibility to their beneficiaries, you know, of pension funds and of other sort of institutional funds, to ensure that they're making investments in the best interests of the fund, investments that won't lose money, for example, or will not be against the corporate governance standards that they care about. And so there really needs to be more work done on this, on risk assessment. And we've done some of that frontline research with respect to the Dakota Access Pipeline, but I really think this is a critical moment for that piece.
Well, and it's beyond pipelines. I mean, we're talking about really any infrastructure project that has significant economic or indigenous risk has to now be looked at differently.
Yeah, and it's human rights risk also, because, you know, we're but a small part in the indigenous space of this whole broader moment that's happening, and we're an important part of it. But I think what's really going to move markets is a deeper understanding of where things are socially, where there is social exposure and risk to companies, and how to ensure that their investments are protected through company behavior.
What do you think's the next way this plays out with the Dakota Access Pipeline?
In what respect, Mark?
Well, the company's got its own time clock and they're burning cash. They now have to decide whether they're going to spend more cash on litigation or try to take next steps. I'm just curious if you've had thoughts about what that means right now in terms of this fight.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to be on the exec team at Energy Transfer right now, and I sure wouldn't want to be a shareholder of that company right now, because I think there's a whole spectrum of possibilities, from bankruptcy to, you know, maybe some effort at appeal of the district court's decision. But this is definitely a crisis moment for them. And you know, what I keep thinking about with respect to this situation is the tribe tried to tell them in 2014, 6 years ago, that this was not a good idea and that the tribe was against it. And they chose not to listen. And I think what's really playing out here is they chose not to listen at their own peril. And a lot of times extractive industry companies will do that because there's so much money to be made that it kind of doesn't matter that they'll take the risk. But this was a big failure. And I think that, you know, I hope that there's a lesson learned here.
Well, in fact, in the court documents, it's stunning to say, the companies say, well, but we've already done this. And the response is, yeah, but you were warned not to. And they did it anyway, knowing the risk. And now getting caught. It's very common in cities to have people ignore zoning code and to go ahead and do something. And then when they have to take it down because they ignored those codes, there's nothing that can be done. And it's similar in that sense.
Right. And I mean, you just have to look at what the Supreme Court did last week in the McGirt case to really know that these issues that are longstanding in Indian country may be dormant for a period of time because of these legal and regulatory battles that seem kind of endless, but they do eventually have a path to resolution. And if this week has shown us anything, that, the wind's really at the backs of Indian people right now in that regard. And if I were somebody who were thinking about investment in Indian country, I think I'd be thinking about doing it differently.
Well, and that's where I wanted to go with this to wrap it up is right now it's all been playing defense, but there's a really amazing opportunity here, both in the NFL space and in natural resource extraction on how to do it right and make money from doing it right. Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the work that our program does is about trying to think through what sustainable investment looks like for Indigenous peoples that's consistent with free, prior, and informed consent. And sustainability has shown itself to be a very important economic driver, especially right now, where, for example, extractive industries are really struggling and maybe having their last gasp. I think there's a lot of excitement around the possibility of renewable energy and community-based projects. So we're really trying to think about how to thread the needle on that and look forward to what's next and look forward to doing it differently.
Now you think about how significantly in 3 months the world has changed. You look at rush hour in almost any city and it's gone. And all of a sudden, all of the oil that we had to have to do things the way we thought we did is no longer needed. And so even if the company wins or any company wins, it doesn't change the landscape. People have already shifted.
Yeah, and I think the kind of acceptance that, this is the only way we can do it has really been disrupted. And that I think it really creates space for innovation and to do things better, to do things, to borrow a term, in a decolonized way, and really think about how to build our communities for a sustainable future.
What's the same type of play in the world of sports with that opportunity for doing things different?
Right. I mean, I've heard a lot in the last several weeks talking to folks who are outside our community, people in the media and so on, about how they viewed these issues. And I think the word that you hear over and over again is honor. And what I've been telling people is, if you really want to honor somebody, what you will do is listen to them. And it's the same thing as we're talking about with the Dakota Access Pipeline situation. It's really the principle that underlies self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent is we have a voice, and that voice needs to be listened to. And there's an opportunity to do that now. And we'll see if the sports folks take it up.
How does this change your conversations with investors, with the investment community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really for folks that really look at environmental, social, and governance factors, it really is proof of concept that that these issues move markets. For folks that don't, I think it's fair warning that that there is risk exposure here. And so just like with everything else, I think it's really important to hang on to our allies and then build allyship and understanding in the broader frameworks.
Does this make it easier for the investment community to look at Indian country as an opportunity and say we should be putting some of our money to work?
I think so. I mean, that's the flip side of the coin, right? It's not just do no harm, but it's really how can we partner meaningfully with these communities? And when you think about sports mascots, it's really a situation where we could be honored as, the warriors or something because we're an artifice of the past. And I think what this whole movement has shown and what the McGirt decision and the DAPL decision show is we have vibrant, powerful communities here that are ready to engage.
Well, the Supreme Court, who would have I covered the Herrera case, and just from the questions from Justice Gorsuch, you knew the times had changed. This was no longer the Rehnquist court. And you're looking at this long arc suddenly shifting, and it's something that's been building.
Yeah, and I mean, Justice Gorsuch, I've always known that he would be a powerful ally for Indian people. He comes out of the 10th Circuit. He has a deep understanding of Indian law through the cases that we see in our circuit here in Colorado and the West. And I also think that it shows that our issues are apolitical. Even where a court could be highly politicized, there's a matter of constitutional interpretation that's pretty uncontrovertible with respect to our issues. And that's what we saw play out in the McGirt case.
After celebrating these two big wins, what's next for Peoples Worldwide?
Well, we have to keep on keeping on the sports issue. We've been called to service in that regard, and we've mentioned Susan White several times, and we really carry on that work in her honor. And we also are working to build tools for investors to be able to engage better and more proactively with Indian country. So in the next several months, we're really working on a model to get renewable energy development into the hands of tribes alongside social investors.
Carla Fredericks, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's another edition of Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant.
This is Indian Country Today.